في السياسة، هل لمحتويات الخطاب الأهمية التي نظنها عادة؟ ما أهمية التواصل غير اللفظي في فعالية خطاب ما؟ وتعابير الوجه والإيماءات وطبقات الصوت. ما هي العناصر العاطفية والعقلانية التي تحدد ردود الفعل الإيجابية أو السلبية تجاه سياسي ما؟ ولماذا ثمة سياسيون أكثر جاذبية من غيرهم؟
I think charisma is a combination of being able to connect with the audience and having a sort of conversational relationship with the audience. This type of charisma is, I think, very well embodied by American leaders like Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, who I think resemble each other in that regard. But I think charisma is also comparable to what we call projection when we talk to the voice. Charisma means to have an effect not only on your immediate surroundings, but being able to have an effect sort of at a distance as well, to communicate in a way that impresses people.
Charisma is the capacity to attract attention so that people will look at an individual, combined with that magic of changing how they feel, and in the long run how they think and act.
A charismatic person is someone that impresses you, that they're interesting, they're appealing, they have some degree of charm, and you trust their leadership.
على مدى 30 عاما الماضية، أتاح لنا تطور علمي الأعراق البشرية والنفس مع تقدم تقنيات الصوت والصورة فهم بعض عناصر الجاذبية الشخصية في عالم السياسة بشكل أفضل. الملوك والأميرات ورؤساء الدول والقادة السياسيون حاولوا الظهور دائما أقوياء وواثقين بأنفسهم. هذا جزء من الصورة التي يجب أن يبرزها القائد، وهذا أيضا ما يتوقعه الناس من قائد. لكن لغة الجسد السياسية تطورت كثيرا عبر التاريخ. قبل أقل من قرن، عندما كان القادة السياسيون يعبرون عن أنفسهم أمام آلاف الناس، كانوا يقفون على منبر وكانت الجماهير تراهم من بعيد. كانت الوقفة ونبرة الصوت هما العنصرين المسيطرين على التواصل غير اللفظي، وكانت لغة الجسد تمتاز بطبيعة مسرحية ومغالا فيها أحيانا. لقد أثر اختراع التلفاز على لغة السياسيين الجسدية والطريقة التي يتواصلون بها مع العامة. فالتلفاز عزز قوة الصور وقدم القادة السياسيين عن قرب أمام جماهير من ملايين الناس. اليوم لا يمكن لسلوك السياسيين الإفلات من الكاميرات نتيجة تعابير وجوههم وإيماءاتهم وطريقة وقوفهم. العرض المفرط للشخصيات السياسية يحولهم إلى نجوم إعلاميين حقيقيين. وفي الوقت نفسه تعالج المعلومات عمليا في وقت حدوثها، وتصل بشكل أسرع في ساعة محددة وبشكل مجزأ، مما يزيد أهمية القدرة على الإقناع وكسب القبول في غضون دقائق.
Sometimes People are convinced by ancient myths. Thus, in politics, nothing would matter but what is actually said. However, most voters know their politicians only through a TV screen, where the image is almighty. All of you will watch the same speeches of political leaders. Those of you in Group 1 will only have the images. You in Group 2 will have the images and the voice. And you will have the images and the filtered voice. So I'm going to ask you to choose just one emotion.
For many Americans, these 4 months have brought sorrow and pain. To fight it together.
I've checked your answers, so the great majority of all groups has seen Ronald Reagan as a happy person. Jacques Chirac too. Funnily enough, Bush and even Blair appear to you as being worried, anxious or fearful. The conclusion is that most observers correctly recognize the emotions of a political leader just by referring to his face, and this in less than 2 seconds.
مؤخرا أكدت التجارب التي تستخدم الرنين المغناطيسي أن رد فعلنا على صورة قائد سياسي يتقرر في معظمه بواسطة منطقة العاطفة في الدماغ.
With our visual brain, we judge the faces of unknown politicians either positively or negatively. 1 second is just enough for us to vote for faces we find more competent or more attractive. As a matter of fact, such decision involves less our rational cortex than the limbic system, which is the center of our instinctive primary emotions. Supporters of a leader may react to his or her smiling face, just as in the case of love at first sight. In their brain, the areas activated are those of happiness, pleasure. Their eye pupils tend to dilate unconsciously. Opponents to the leader tend to contract their pupils, and the areas activated in their brain are those of anger or disgust.
دماغنا العاطفي يدفعنا إلى التصرف كالرئيسيات عندما تراقب فردا آخر في مجموعتها. هل هو مسيطر ومطمئن وواثق بنفسه؟ هل يشعرنا بالأمان؟ أم هو قلق وخائف وغير مطمئن؟ بروفيسور روجر ماستر يدرس هذه الجذور الأساسية للسياسة منذ أكثر من 20 سنة.
The basic characteristic of our primate heritage is that we have these ways of displaying feelings and potential actions with cues that tell other people what we're feeling and what we might do. The human's facial display behavior is similar to that of non-human primates, and there are 3 main types: fear, anger, and happy reassurance. This is the fear display. You see the brows are down, the eyes are open, aware of things in the environment. The nose is breathing in air in case of need of flight, tight-lipped. If you look at the anger threat display, you see very, very different. You can see both upper and lower teeth. Brows are really intense. The reassurance and happy display, very, very different. The raised eyebrows, the eyes are not staring, and there's the smile with both upper and lower teeth showing. Politics is part of human nature. Aristotle described humans as the political animal. Primates have, in general, the experience of leadership. There's some difference between the leader of the group and others in the group. And in humans, we have the same process.
إيماءات القادة وطريقة وقوفهم تعبر عن السيطرة.
A slogan I want to offer, change we can believe in.
Leadership is about the combination of cooperation and competition. This is true in primates. Among the great apes, the leader has to have the support of other members of the band. In politics, before you run for president, you've got to get the nomination of your party. So that clearly the whole trick of combining competition with some people with cooperation and alliance with others is the name of the game.
Political campaign in humans, what is it? It is basically energizing your base to get them to support you and to win over others. But chimpanzees do the same thing. If normally the males are not very interested in babies. And so in the same way that human politicians hold their babies and kiss them all the time during campaigns, chimpanzee males will do the same thing in order to become popular. And if they're very popular, they are more successful at challenging somebody else.
Governor Bush, thank you for coming to our school and for your visit. That love can outlast hate, that the light of human life can shine on through the most terrible darkness.
ذخيرتنا من تعابير الوجه أغنى كثيرا منها لدى القردة، وعواطفنا أكثر تعقيدا، ولدينا في الوجه عضلات أكثر مما لدى القردة، مما يسمح لنا بإظهار عواطف مختلطة ومجموعة كبيرة من التعابير. طور البروفيسور نيك يوسيب برنامج كمبيوتر يتيح لنا تحليل نسب العواطف المتنوعة التي تظهر على الوجه.
Our system is based on an appearance-based model. So this means that we have a mask which is fitting on the face, and this one will trace the movement of the facial muscles so that it will just reflect the actual facial expressions. So when we construct the mask, we use a simplified model of the muscle of the face. So what we have in there, we have pairs of 12 muscles, and these one are used to capture the most predominant movement of the face, like movement of the mouth, cheeks, eyebrows, and the upper part of the face. Blair in this picture is showing a very, very clear expression of happiness. So he is extremely expressive, and he shows all the characteristics of this emotion. So the mouth wide open, the eyes a little bit closer, and he is very convincing.
Now, how about Nicolas Sarkozy?
Well, I mean, he is certainly gesticulating a lot, and I think his face is less charismatic than others. And he has a very strange combination of different emotions.
Oh yes, we can see here a sadness, for example.
So he's not that expressive, even though he's trying to emphasize this one by moving his hands.
Yes, but especially he's less authoritative than people believe, because people believe he has a very strong authority. Now, you can't have a strong authority if you're sad or if you're fearful.
Right. George Bush is a very good example of the way he's combining contradictory facial expressions. So you can see traces of happiness, like 11%, but on the other hand, he's also angry and disgust. And I think this is very characteristic of him. So in some sense, showing some very positive part, and on the other hand, he's very determined and a little bit, sad and worried about the subject. So in this sequence depicting Ronald Reagan, you can see that he is a very, very good actor. He can show good combination of emotions, so happiness, so he has a good smile, and then some determination, which is given by the angry and the disgust. In most of the cases, indeed, we, as human beings, we have different facial expressions when showing a neutral expression. So the idea is that, indeed, some of the people will have a sad face or a more smiley face. A good example of a politician who has a natural sad, neutral face will be George Bush. And another example would be, for example, Tony Blair would be a more happy face. What we notice is that, in general, we have blended emotions. That's true. However, in some cases, like when a person is showing happiness or surprise, you can see very high percentage of these emotions. And from our experience, it seems that the positive emotions tend to be more absolute, and the negative emotions tend to be more blended.
Para esta tierra esté en la Junta de Andalucía.
تعابير الوجه القوية تعتبر علامات واضحة على السلطة والسيطرة أو علامات على السعادة والابتهاج، لكنها لا تعكس إطلاقا علامات القلق أو الحزن. كما من الضروري أن تتناغم تعابير الوجه مع إيماءات الجسم وطريقة الوقوف. هذا عنصر آخر مهم لتحقق الجاذبية.
Imagine politicians that don't gesture, that have their hands and arms rigidly by their bodies. You would find that very strange. You would find them not only stiff, but also uncommunicative. Most of the gestures that you see politicians make serve two main purposes. One is simply to emphasize a point.
Still a force for freedom and peace and democracy at home and around the world. I am convinced more than ever in my life that the best days of this country are still ahead of us.
The other aspect is that with the change in the hand shape or in the motion pattern, units of speech are marked off.
To work through the details of it and make sure
new unit of speech begins with a new hand shape or a new motion pattern. So in effect, the viewer knows how to structure what he or she is hearing from watching the gestural motions. But there are also a number of more specific gestures, or gestures that have more specific meanings. To this day, politicians are very fond of making the gesture of the precision grip, which was already described in ancient Rome in politicians during that time. It suggests that what's being said right now is something very specific, right? You pick out a specific object that you're talking about, or you say something very specific about that object. A very common kind of gesture that you find among politicians simply uses kind of chopping motion, a kind of slicing motion, which is then made with a variety of different hand shapes. The precision grip, an extended pointing index finger, a flat hand, which kind of emphasizes the slicing motion, and so on.
A critical national security issue for our future, and politics must stop at the schoolhouse door.
It's important that you look at the context in which the gesture is made and not believe that there is a fixed meaning to the particular gesture.
En sentimiento, y por tanto se puede hablar de solidaridad.
You do sometimes find politicians making iconic gestures, as for example George W. Bush putting his hands as if he's strangulating something while he says the grip of terror.
Slowly but surely, the grip of terror around the throats of the Iraqi people is being loosened.
Another way of thinking about this gesture is to think about it as a metaphor, because the word grip of terror, of course, is a metaphor, and so the gesture emphasizes that metaphorical quality of his talk. Among radical, populist political leaders, you often find a body language that kind of runs against the established norms. So by performing in an outrageous kind of manner, they seek to appeal to the masses that are fed up with the established political system. A good example of that is Mussolini, who in this segment not only uses sort of a very theatrical body motion, but also explains his concepts by gesture in a way that is very uncommon among established politicians. A part of bodily behavior that we don't usually think much about is how people walk. And it seems that in ancient Rome, there was a class of politicians gaining an influence during the Republic, and they came from the provinces, from the country. And they had a very different style of moving than the urban elite of Rome. And so they embodied their politics by walking in what used to be called a rustic kind of way. Tendency to moderate gesture has a lot to do with the way the human body is seen in Western culture. Christianity plays a part in that. And so, for example, during the Middle Ages, when somebody gestured exuberantly, that was seen as a sign that the person was unable to control his or her bodily urges. To this day, the proscription against all too expressive gestures is motivated by the idea that there is a lack of self-control in the speaker. Whereas, as a communication scholar, I would say the more you gesture and the more complex your gestures are, the more you actually communicate with your audience. I think we're experiencing a real renaissance of gesture, and I think that this may have something to do with the visual nature of today's society.
Give me a break. This whole thing is the biggest fairy tale I've ever seen.
في حين أننا قد نميز عواطف قادتنا السياسيين ونواياهم من خلال تعابير وجوههم، لكن قدرتهم على إقناعنا تعتمد كثيرا على نوعية الصوت وطبقاته.
To believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans.
La voix est liée à la façon dont on est en communication avec l'autre et avec le monde. Et de ce point de vue-là, qui n'est pas forcément un point de vue scientifique, mais plutôt psychologique, eh bien, la voix est liée à l'intention de celui qui parle, et l'intention de celui qui parle va pouvoir s'entendre en écoutant le timbre de la voix.
From every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside, I have a dream today. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Parce que la voix, c'est finalement cet équilibre entre le dehors et le dedans, entre l'impression et l'expression.
And freed a country from brutal oppression.
Les différents types de voix sont les voix de face, qui se caractérisent par une direction, la direction de la face. Donc les voix de face sont des voix très pontifiantes souvent, qui cherchent souvent à convaincre, On a ensuite qu'on peut assimiler aux voix de face les voix de bouche, les voix qui mettent en jeu spécialement la cavité buccale. Par exemple, nous avons Tony Blair qui a une voix où la bouche est active, ce qui donne quelque chose d'aigu dans la voix. La voix va dégager des harmoniques aiguës et quelque chose d'assez émissif. En ce qui concerne les voix de nez ou les voix de bouche, les voix plutôt en avant, on pourrait trouver la voix de Bill Clinton, qui n'a pas véritablement une voix globale, timbrée, donc thoracique. Sa voix est plutôt aiguë, ce serait aussi une voix de bouche, avec un côté relativement nasillard.
At the special NATO summit this summer, that is what we will begin to do. We must strengthen NATO's partnership for peace with non-member allies.
Alors nous avons également les voix de larynx, ou dites également voix de gorge. Les voix de gorge, c'est des voix qui sont plutôt serrées dans la gorge, ce qui témoigne d'une recherche du mot, d'une recherche... Le mot prime sur la résonance, et donc ils sont moins charismatiques, toujours, que les voix plutôt résonantes. Les voix qui peuvent être particulièrement insécurisantes sont des voix qui font intervenir surtout la gorge, ou des voix qui font intervenir massivement la tête, c'est-à-dire qu'on ne trouve pas cette totalité corporelle.
And to make a case in the democracy, you must convince by yourself. Excuse me, I'm not convinced.
You promise a meeting at that high a level before you know what the intentions are. I don't want to be used for propaganda purposes.
Donc Hillary Clinton, pour moi, serait quelqu'un, de par sa voix, si on écoute simplement sa voix, de faussement assuré, parce que sa voix témoigne d'une certaine fragilité, étant donné son timbre plutôt laryngé et de tête. On ne peut pas parler chez Hillary Clinton d'une véritable voix thoracique ou séductrice ou très affirmée, comme on pourrait par exemple entendre chez Margaret Thatcher.
Together our nations have faced the challenges of our time and have not flinched. We forged ahead with strengthening the peace, spreading prosperity, and safeguarding liberty.
Hillary Clinton donc joue sur le registre de l'émotion parce que justement cette non-assurance de sa voix laisse entendre cette fragilité émotionnelle, laisse entendre aussi qu'elle se livre plus ou moins volontairement. Alors les voix de ventre, ce sont les voix les plus prisées parce qu'elles vont donner un bon point d'appui et vont donner des harmoniques aiguës abondantes. Et donc, c'est un très bon équilibre entre le grave et l'aigu. On trouve ça particulièrement chez Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan qui non seulement témoigne d'une bonne tenue de la voix, c'est-à-dire d'une voix de ventre, mais une voix de ventre qui va allumer tout l'ensemble, ce qui lui donne une voix équilibrée et très harmonique et harmonieuse.
The exemplar of freedom and a beacon of hope for those who do not now have freedom. To those neighbors and allies who share our freedom, we will strengthen our historic ties and assure them of our support and firm commitment. We will match loyalty with loyalty. We will strive for mutually beneficial...
عنصر آخر مهم في فعالية الرسائل هو عدد الكلمات في الدقيقة.
Money cannot buy it. Power cannot compel it. Technology cannot create it. It can only come from the human spirit.
حتى إن كانت هناك فروقات ثقافية بين اللغات، فقد أجريت اختبارات تبين أن السرعة المناسبة تتراوح عادة بين 140 و 180 كلمة في الدقيقة. عندما تقل الكلمات عن 140 يتضاءل اهتمام الجمهور ويشعر بالضجر، وعندما تفوق 180 كلمة يزداد تدفق الكلمات ولا تفهم الرسالة.
respects rule of law. But in the debate on migration, I remind my fellow
فترات التوقف أثناء الخطاب مهمة أيضا، رغم أن الوقفات قد تعكس أحيانا التردد والشك.
Or how we used our intelligence to, for example, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror.
The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger.
I think usually you find a lot of coherence or consistency in the different communicative media that we use in everyday communication, meaning gaze, gesture, body posture, and speech. They go together actually in very subtle, very intricate ways, but every so often you find that there's a discrepancy between somebody's, let's say, facial expression and the content of what the person is saying. I think the American President Bush is an example of that. You often find him showing a facial expression that does not seem to congruent with the content of his speech. One thing that is striking about the facial expression of George W. Bush is its asymmetry, and you can see that asymmetry especially clearly in his eyebrows. When he uses his eyebrows, he raises his eyebrows to convey emphasis. They often end up in different positions, one being higher than the other, and that makes his face look as if he finds what he's saying funny. People have a very difficult time interpreting that.
Well, but what wasn't wrong was the fact that he had the ability to make a weapon.
So the asymmetry of Bush's face is also visible in the mouth. His mouth is diagonal and his face is longer on one side and shorter on the other. It is crooked, as we say.
This is all in the context of war.
Coherence usually comes naturally, but when there is a lack of coherence, somebody needs help.
Growing up, she gave me love and lots of advice. I gave her white hair.
The public can, of course, sense at its emotional levels whether they are seeing a strong, self-confident behavior or a behavior which is, to some degree, acting strong without really having that inner strength just subconsciously.
الجاذبية السياسية وتأثير القائد يعتمدان كثيرا على السياق التاريخي والثقافي والاجتماعي للدولة.
There's one kind of charisma which occurs when a society is under threat and a charismatic leader shows strength. He shows he's not afraid of this threat, and he can bring his entire society, if they follow him, to have enough self-confidence to overcome that threat. Now, in Hitler's case, that involved showing a tremendous amount of aggression in his nonverbal behavior. If you look at a speech of Hitler's, at the beginning, when he mounts on the podium, you can see some signs of insecurity. What he was extremely clever about doing was to create a great deal of energy. He spoke with great force. And then he had this trick of having trained his followers to have those shared emotions, like he would say something and instead of applause, the audience would all go Heil Hitler at the same time. Well, this gave this image of enormous power because he was speaking with terrific energy and focus and triggering these wild responses of huge crowds And that was what was being presented in the media, remembering that the media in Hitler's time were movies. And the camera would be placed in a certain place, which would make him look good, and then the resulting film would be edited in a way to remove any sign of weakness. That is, we have a very different world in TV because TV catches what's there.
رغم أن الثقافة السياسية للعامة تطورت خلال العقود القليلة الماضية، إلا أن جميع الصور السياسية المنقولة عبر التلفاز ووسائل الإعلام الحديثة تميل إلى حمل الناس على العمل وفق مبدأ السلوكيات المتناقضة. يجري الدماغ غريزيا مقارنة مرئية بين القادة السياسيين المختلفين، حيث تحفظ صور معينة بلا وعي، كصور السياسيين يغادرون السيارات أو يبتسمون أو يصافحون، وتبين أيضا تعابير التوتر أو الحزن أو القلق. من خلال تحديد نسب التعابير الإيجابية والسلبية وطريقة الوقوف، ينتج دماغ العامة عفويا وصفا مقارنا من ناحية السلطة والثقة والألفة. السر في كسب الشعبية يتمثل عادة في مزيج من 3 عناصر: السلطة والحيوية والسعادة.
While there are differences between societies and cultures in what voters expect from their politicians and what kind of public performance they expect from their politicians, cultures, of course, also change over time, and expectations change, and they may change very rapidly.
You forecast 2 things. First, that the decade would be less dangerous if the West maintained the strength required for peace.
التغير في توقعات العامة يعكس عادة تغيرات في المجتمع، ومن التغييرات الرئيسية في دول عديدة خلال العقود القليلة الماضية الدور المتزايد للمرأة ووصولها إلى مواقع القيادة.
I'm thrilled to have everyone here on this stage who represents the past, the present and the future of our country.
أثبتت الأبحاث أن النساء أكثر تعبيرا من الرجال من حيث عفويتهن وتفاعلهن، خاصة من خلال الابتسام والضحك اللذين قد يكونان سلاحين سياسيين.
I think women tend to be more low-key in their public performances and not as they don't make the same kinds of attempts to project power in their gestures and through their body language.
Mountaintops and in caves, you will not escape the justice of this nation.
طريقة الرجال في الوقوف والإيماء والتواصل الجسدي مبنية على النمط البدائي للذكر المسيطر، بينما تستخدم النساء أسلوب التشارك والتبادل ويبدين أكثر تعبيرا وتلقيا.
In general, you can notice some statistical difference between men and women, in the sense that women tend to be more happy, more enthusiastic, and men seems to be more pragmatic, in the sense that they show traces of anger or disgust. However, there are different women which are so-called strong women, which tend to show a lot of emotions that are characteristic to men.
Mr. President, when you welcome me to the White House...
Alors, lorsque l'État central, en fonctionnant mieux et en étant au clair et en harmonie avec les...
الصراع السياسي وهيمنة الرجال في السياسة يجبران النساء على تبني أسلوب الرجال، حيث يظهرن السلطة وأحيانا العدوانية، ليظهرن على الأقل بذات الجدارة والكفاءة كأندادهن الذكور. التحدي الحقيقي للنساء في السياسة هو العثور على التوازن الصحيح بين تعابير السعادة والتعاطف والتقبل، وهي صفات طبيعية في المرأة، والتعابير العنيفة للسلطة، وهي صفة طبيعية في الرجل. هيلاري كلينتون حققت هذا التوازن بنجاح. الابتسام والسعادة يساهمان في تحقيق الشعبية للرجال والنساء على حد سواء. الإغواء جزء من الجاذبية الشخصية، والابتسام سلاح قوي في الإغواء. لكن ماذا عن ابتسامات قادتنا السياسيين؟
Most of the smiles we make, unless we're having a great time, are not the true smiles of enjoyment. They're social smiles, they're agreement smiles, sometimes false smiles. The difference is a very subtle difference. It's not in the lips, not in the cheeks. It's in what's called the eye cover fold, this little patch of skin between your eyebrow and your upper eyelid, which slightly moves down if it's an enjoyment smile, but very subtle, not easy to recognize.
في السياسة يتوقف الأمر كله على التوازن بين السلوك الطبيعي والمواقف المدروسة. حتى إن تم التدرب عليها، كلما بدت طبيعية أكثر كانت فعالة أكثر. من المهم للسياسيين تحديد تمثيل دقيق لصورتهم ليستطيعوا استخدام الأسلوب المناسب وفقا للموقف. إذن في هذه الحالات أيمكننا التوقع من ساستنا أن يكونوا عفويين أو مخلصين؟
I'm not going to comment on that.
I don't think it is likely that you're going to be elected to a high office unless you're quite a good performer, public performer. So yes, they do have the skills to be able to mislead us when they choose to do so, and we probably all know that when we elect them. Now in this country, in the United States, people say the characteristic they value most in a politician is honesty. On the other hand, everyone's very cynical about whether politicians ever really tell us the truth.
And we'll find out about the weapons of mass destruction that we all thought were there. That's part of the Iraqi survey group and the group I put together to look at.
My research shows very clearly that most people cannot tell when someone is lying to them from demeanor, from their face, body, voice, and speech. Less than 5% who are at all accurate from demeanor.
Well, but what wasn't wrong was the fact that he had the ability to make a weapon.
Although there is no Pinocchio's nose, there are signs of an emotion that doesn't fit what we're saying, or that we're thinking more than we would be expected to think.
How do you respond to critics who say that you brought the nation to war under false pretenses?
Yes. First of all, I expected to find the weapons.
There are these signs, we call them hotspots, and when you see them, they suggest, here's a place where you're not getting the full story, find out why.
Now, I have to go back to work on my State of the Union speech, and I worked on it till pretty late last night. But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
Where you see signs of a lie can vary from one person to another. For him, it's in the use of distancing language, where he puts the person at a distance from himself. So it's, I never had sexual relations with that woman.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
It would have been more convincing if he said, I never had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, rather than putting the distance. So that is really the main suggestion that he's not telling the truth. But we see before that, before he says a word, he sucks in and bites his lower lip, which is a mannerism that's not uncommon for him, but is a mannerism that you see in children who are about to tell you an untruth. I try to distinguish between truthfulness and lying, and then there's a fuzzy area in between. Now, in a lie, I'm deliberately trying to mislead you, and I've given you no reason to think that that's what I'm going to do. So an actor can't lie, because you know that an actor is not going to be telling you the truth. They're playing a role. But if they're a good actor, then you are gripped by it and you believe it. So is the actor lying? No, he's not lying, because you're notified. In some sense, we don't expect politicians to tell us all the truth. Certainly not in public, where it could be used by their domestic enemies and their international enemies.
I know you are worried. First of all, if we are communists. And of course, I have said very clear that we are not communists. Very clear.
So, can politicians lie? In my definition, no, but they can deceive us, and we expect them to deceive us. Now, in a democracy, that's a real problem, because if an electorate is not informed, how is it going to make a choice? And yet, if everything that the politician says to us is heard by his opponents and by his enemies internationally, he can't tell us all the truth. So it's a dilemma for which I don't have a solution.